Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Terumais, Pedig Beis, Halacha Beis, and Halacha Gimel. We're learning today Daf Chav Dalet. We left off on Daf Chav Gimel Amid Beis, Mamish, at the last line of the Amid. We even actually read a little bit on Daf Chav Dalet, Amid Aleph on the top. But until the whole Sugya, until Halacha Gimel is one continuum, and very important for us to hold in mind the whole thread, which begins with the following. Number one, we're going to focus today exclusively on the Tana Rabbi Yossi, who says that if a person has pressed figs and they have fresh figs, they have te'enim, which is a fresh fig, and they have a groigeris, they have pressed figs, one is allowed to give truma or meiser from the pressed on the fresh. And in that, let's say, leniency, because it is a leniency for the gifter, the case that we were giving is that a Levi who has 100 figs, 90 of them are fresh. That means that they are large. Only 10 of them are pressed, and therefore they're smaller, that he is allowed to give the 10 pressed to the kohen, keeping the 90 bigger, fresher ones for himself. And the question is, why is one allowed to do it? So we had a machlokes between two Amiroim, Rabbi Yirmiyah on one side, and Rabbi Yoina and the Amoire Rabbi Yossi on the other side. There are many ways of learning the sugya. I spent some time yesterday trying to learn it in a mahalach that it goes nicely, flows nicely until the end. So let's use these concepts. Rabbi Yirmiyah says that you look in the present as this was in the past. You see into the present what the past used to be. Since even the pressed figs used to be fresh, they used to be larger. So Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying that the Tana Rabbi Yossi agrees that one should give Trumas u'Maisros really based on its volume. If he says you can give 10 pressed figs, you're giving the coin something of lesser volume. No, you're not. Halachically, the pressed is as if it is now the way it always used to be. As the Marafulda writes, that Ki'ilu heim tofeyach de mi'ikarein. Those were his words. Or the words of Rabbi Yirmiyah proper is atoroya esatzame ki'ilu tofeyach. Look at the pressed as if it is right now fresh or large, swollen. So says Rabbi Yirmiyah. The other two Amoraim, Rabbi Yoina and the Amoire Rabbi Yossi, says that is not the logic behind the Tana Rabbi Yossi, because you cannot see in the present the past. They even add the words, they would be open into seeing the future in the present. They're open to doing that. But we don't need to do that. What they're really saying is that you look at the present. Right now, these figs are shriveled up. They're not swollen. The fact that the Tana Rabbi Yossi says that you can give 10 pressed figs to the kohen and keep the 90 fresh for yourself, that's because for some reason the Tana Rabbi Yossi holds that trumos and maisres by figs only have to be given by the number. I don't care volume, I don't care size, I don't care weight, I only care number. Number, I gave 10%. I have 100, I gave 10. Same thing would be by truma. You have 100, you give 2. You only care about the minyan, you don't care about the midah. That was the beginning of our sugya. Now, from there, we went into a Mishnah in Taharos. You have to chop the whole thread over here. The Mishnah had a Reisha and a Seifa. The Gemara quotes the Reisha, but really, we are up to the focus on the Seifa. The Reisha makes a simple rule, that even if you start out with something that has one of the many examples, it has the right shiur that will allow it to convey tuma. So kibetza, not only is it tummy, which is a fact, it's able to convey tuma. If for whatever reason it shriveled up, it used to be a kibetza, it's no longer a kibetza. So the Mishnah says it cannot convey tuma. Now, I want you to know that if you just focus on this ratio, it's already problematic according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, right? When Rabbi Yirmiyah says that when you look at the present, you see in the present the past. Well, the question will be: you look at this piece of food. True, right now it's not a kibetza. Used to be a kibetza. That's something that we'll address today. We did not address it at all yesterday, so just bear with me. Then the Mishnah said that if you have a food not in the size of a kibetza, but you soak it in water and it swells up and now it hits the size of a kibetza, it conveys tumah. That is what it says in the Sefer. The question is, what is the case of the Sefer? So here we are left off that there are two opinions. The Chachamim of the Dorim, Diroimoi Omri, that when do we say that if you have food that's tummy and you put it in water and it swells up and now it hits the size of a kibetza, it could convey tumah only if it was originally in the size of a kibetza. Then it got shriveled. When it gets shriveled, it no longer could convey. Now, if you soaked it in water and it went back to the way it used to be, since it used to be that way and it's now this way, it could convey tumah. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish argue and they say no, that the Sefer of the Mishnah and Taharis is true, even if it was never in the minimum size of a kibetza. Doesn't matter. If you soaked it in water, right now it has the size of a kibetza, right now it could convey tumah. Just for the record, for the accuracy, the actual case that the Roimoi is talking about is the case of a kazayas. So they're talking about a meat that's part of a carcass of a dead animal called an avela. For that to impart tumah, it has to have the size of a kazayas. Same idea. So if it had a size of a kazayas and it shriveled, Reisha says it cannot be matame anymore. Seifa says if it has less the size of a kazayas and it swells up, it could impart tumah. Machloik is, what is the case of the Seifa? Okay, that is where we left off. And I'm going to already speak it out right now because we have to hold the whole Gemara is one thread. What I'm saying now is not according to all opinions here, but according to many of them. So the first step is that the Deroimoi are aligned with Rabbi Yirmiyah, and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are aligned with Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yossi. How? Very simple. Only look at the Sefer. I know that there'll be a problem with the Reisha. I know that. But only look at the Sefer. Okay, what does the Deroimoi say? That if it used to be in the past the size of a kazayas, if it used to be, now we allow it to impart tumah. If it never was in the past in the size of a kazayas, even though now you soaked it in water and it swelled up, it cannot convey tumah. What does that show you? According to the Deroimoi, that when you look at the present, it's not enough to look at the present. What do you also have to see in the present? The past. Only if in the past it was in the minimum amount, now it can be matamel. That sounds like Rabbi Yirmiyah, who says in the Tana Rabbi Yossi that we see in the present the past. Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yossi, who argue with Rabbi Yirmiyah, and they say that when you look at the present, don't see the past in the present. Don't see the past in the present. We don't care about the past. What are you looking at? You're looking only at the present. So says Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, if right now it has the size of a kazayas or the size of a kibetza, so right now you have the right amount. I don't care if in the past it never had that size. Makes sense? On some level, it makes sense. That is where we left off yesterday. Go ahead.
Wait, but how can the area have this be like lined up with the Southerners? Because they're saying that only once it gets swollen back up, then it can convey to
what Aviv, you're saying good, and there's many other questions on that. So what Aviv is saying is, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, we don't even need it for right now for it to have the right size. Because in the case of the figs, the fig is smaller, the shriveled, than the big one. Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying even more than the Deroimoi. Question number one. Question number two, what do you do with the Reisha? What do you do with it? What does the Reisha said? If it had the right size and it shriveled up, what's the din? The Reisha says it cannot contaminate. Why not? That's the problem. That's one of the problems. The way the Mara Fulda will learn the other problem with the whole logic that we said, which is even something more foundational, and that is that even if it were to perfectly line up, just to know the history, Rabbi Yechanan and Eish Lakish and the Chachmei Dorim, they were the earlier Amoraim. Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yoisa, they were later Amoraim. It doesn't make sense for the Gemara, for the Talmud Yerushalmi, to say that a argument that was already discussed by the earlier Amoraim generation is simply being repeated in the later generation. If anything, when Rabbi Yirmiyah learned this topic, Rabbi Yirmiyah should say, you know what, I agree with the Roimoi. Rabbi Yoin and Rabbi Yosef should say, I agree with Rabbi Yechanan and Eish Lakish. They should link it. For them to have a new argument when it comes to our topic of the figs, the pressed figs, the plump figs, to say that it's mamish that it also is a reason why we prefer to say that Rabbi Yirmiyah can learn the Pshat and the Mishnah and Taharos, like all of the opinions, both like the Reimoi and Rabbi Yechanan and Eish Lakish, and the same thing in the reverse, that Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yosi, their opinion by the figs is not related. They can go either way. It's a separate machlokes. What is that separate machlokes? That's something that will speak out when we learn it inside. But just to complete the words of introduction, we're going to introduce and we're going to link the maskana. We're going to link this better understanding with another Mishnah. And I want to say the Mishnah by heart, which is really fascinating. In the Beis HaMikdash, as a rule, there was never chametz. Even though there were many karbanos, flour karbanos, that there were, bread, and it was called lechem, the lechem hapanim. Just because the word is lechem doesn't mean chametz. You can have lechem, that's not chametz, even though nowadays we don't use it that way. If it's not chametz, like we call it matzah, but that's not accurate. That's just a borrowed term. So even though the rule was there is no chametz in the Beis HaMikdash, there were two karbanos that dafka needed to be chametz. Number one, when a person brought a carbon toida, with the carbon toida needed to come 40 loaves of bread, 40 loaves of bread, and they were divided into 4 categories. That means there were 10 loaves of one type, 10 loaves of another type, etc. One group of the 10 loaves, one of these 10 had to be made out of chametz. That's, by the way, those chametz loaves were bechlal not burnt on the base on the mizbeach at all. Actually, from each of the 10, you gave 1 to the kohen. So from the 40, you gave away 4. The 36, you, the owner, kept, and you needed to consume it within the smaller frame of time that a carbon toida has, even though it's a subcategory of a shlamim, and even though a carbon shlamim could be eaten for 2 days and 1 night, the carbon toida can only be eaten for 1 day and 1 night. So you had a very small amount of time, you had a lot of bread that would force people, so to say, to invite many guests to participate in their carbon toida meal. And that's the source of a Suda Seidah. A Suda Seidah from a Thanksgiving carbon. That when you make a Suda Seidah, you invite many people, just like by the carbon toida, 4 of them went to the Kohanim. When you make a Suda Seidah, the ideal is to invite Chachamim in the meal. Okay, so that's number 1. The other time where we brought chametz was on Shavuos. This actually went on the Mizbeach, that together with the animals, with the 2 lambs, came 2 loaves of bread, known as the shtei halechem. Both of these lechems were made out of chametz. This is what everyone knows. Now it's going to get a little bit fun. What's the fun over here? These karbanos, every loaf came with, they were made out of flour that was in a precise measure. Generally, the measure of the flour for a carbon of mincha was a isaron. Okay. And that means there was a measure utensil in the Beis HaMikdash that measured the size of a isaron. And when you made a carbon, you needed to fill it, and you were not allowed to have less than an isaron. You were not allowed to have more than an isaron of flour. It had to be exactly an isaron. When you make a bread and you don't have to have it chametz dik, there's no problem. You have the flour, you have the water, you mix it together, or you have the flour and you have the oil. Really, there are 5 types of menachos, and we just learned it not that long ago on the Rambam, and we review it every year. So it's not so difficult to understand how it worked. Problem is when it comes to chametz. Chametz in English means the dough has to leaven. It has to rise. What makes the dough rise? Really, when you put flour and water together and you just let it rest, at some point it begins to rise on its own. But normally when people wanted to make something chametzdik, they would add in the flour and the water what we would call sourdough. Not sourdough challah. There was a little piece of dough like a starter that was already very chametzdik. And when you would put it in a new mixture of flour and water, that sourdough would be machametzit. It would make it leaven. Problem is, you can only have one isar on a flour. So exactly from where did the sourdough come? If you would have a flour, an isar on a flour, right, Aviv? And then you would take a piece of sourdough and you would put it into these few karbanis that have to be chametzik. That's for sure not okay. Why not? Because now you have an isarin plus. So we're going to see that there is a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and it's going to get very evolved how to understand the challenge that Rabbi Yehuda has on Rabbi Meir, and this will link us back to our topic of if something is currently one way, it used to be another way. It used to be small, now it became big, which is the case of chametz, right? The flour is small. When it expands, when it rises, even though it's airy, it's chametzdik. That's going to be very much connected to our entire topic, and that's going to conclude basically halacha beis. Halacha gimel will be a lot simpler. The Mishnah on Daf Chav Daled Amud Beis is going to go more on the topic of Toirmin min hayafa al hara v'loy al hara al hayafa. That ideal, right? Chelboy mikol chelev. You have to give from the best. And again, we're going to learn the rule that the definition of best is that even if the best, the better quality, the superior quality has the disadvantage that it has a shorter shelf life, it has less durability, and that which is of a inferior quality has a longer shelf life. As an example, for Shira, the winemaker, cooked the wine. Yain mavushal, it sounds from the Mishnah, for sure is a inferior wine because it was cooked, but it lasts longer. Now, Gabriel, are you aware of that? Does cooked wine last? No, cooked wine lasts shorter. It lasts longer. Yain she'ena mavushal. Gabriel is thinking because normally when you cook when you don't cook the wine, it keeps on getting better.
Well, it preserves it. I mean, the pasteurization makes it that there's less bugs.
The pasteurization preserves it. You see from the Mishnah. That will be another example that you should give truma from the non-pasteurized wine because it's superior, even though it won't necessarily last as long as the yayin mavushal. That's going to be part of the Mishnah halacha gimel, and then the Mishnah will go back to the rule that we just began in halacha beis that ain't toimin mimin al she'enoi minoi, and the Mishnah will give more examples of what's min and what's the enoi minoi. Okay, so let's come back over here. So we had the Tana Rabbi Yosi, we had Rabbi Yirmiyah that says that we see in the present the past the way we're learning. And the Gemara is now, let's go to Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis, the last line, that did the Rimoi say that in the Sefer of the Mishnah and Taras, where the Mishnah says, there we were speaking about something that at some point was not a kazayis of an avela, which is the minimum needed to impart tuma, to be mitame. I want to just remind everyone, when you have the words mitame, if you put a chidik under the mem, if it's mitame, that means it absorbs tuma. It acquires tuma. Whenever there's a shva under the mem, mitame means to convey. So for an avela to be mitame, you have to have a kazayis min avela. The Sefer says that if you started out with something that's not a kazayis, you soaked it in water. Now it is a kazayis. It is mitame. So the Reimoy Amri, for who sheyehi kazayis meikari. That's only true if it used to be a kazayis and then it got shriveled and now you soaked it in water. But if it in the miikara, it was not a kazayis, means when you cut it off the nevela, you cut off a piece that's less than a kazayis. Or if you had food that was never the size of a kibetza, even if it acquired tuma, according to those Rishonim that say that the shear of the kibetz is only to impart, not to acquire. And if it never had, says that the Chachamim of Daraim, even though now you soaked it in water and now it's the size of a kazayis, or now it's the size of a kibetza, it won't impart tuma. The logic in the Havamina is, you know why? Because when you look at the present, you also have to see the past. At least also see the past. That's connected to Rabbi Yirmiyah Shita. However, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Tereyoin Amrin in the Seifa of the Mishnah in Taros, that when the Mishnah says in the Seifa that even if you started out with lesser than the share and you soak that in water and now it's swelled up and now it's a kazayis and now it imparts tuma, the way we will word it is because we don't look at the past. We don't look at the past. It's almost more that Rabbi Yochanan is siding with the Baal Tshuva, with Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Don't look at the present. Right now, you're the shear. The period. That sounds more like Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yoisa. That tell Rabbi Yoina, what are you talking about? Right now, the fig is shriveled up. If the Tana Rabbi Yoisa would hold, you have to give it based on the volume. It's not the volume. Rabbi Yoisa is saying that we don't care about the volume. So that's one thing. Now, I want to read the Marafulda because we're going with his understanding. Look in the second line, in the top of the Amid. Umishum de ein svara loimer de afligu Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Rabbi Yoina v'Rabbi Yoisa. Beplukte de roimoy v'Rabbi Yochanan v'Shimon ben Lakish. Just for that. Lefikach mahader ashas v'amar de aldate de Rabbi Yirmiyah. The aldate de Rabbi Yirmiyah. But before we get to the words the aldate de Rabbi Yirmiyah, we're going to now quote the machlekes that we mentioned in Menachos. Okay. And like Aviv mentioned, and it's going to be written a little bit later over here in the Marafulda, that there is a specific question. The specific question is, how can Rabbi Yirmiyah say like Chachmei Daraim? How can they say like Chachmei Daraim? If you're linking this to that Mishnah in Taros, then I have a checkmate question on Rabbi Yirmiyah to begin with. Because the Reisha in the Mishnah says in Taros that if you had a Kazayas of an Avela, and now it's shriveled, the Mishnah says it's not Metame. Well, if we are linking our topic of the figs to the Mishnah in Taros, right, then it should be Metame. Why? Because it used to have a Kazayas. Right now it's shriveled up. So what? Look, put the past in the present. Which is a bigger question. Okay. So therefore, again, like we said, we're going to explain beautifully. We have enough time. It's a very small daf in words. How we're going to separate them. We'll explain how we separate them. And the goal is for Rabbi Yirmiyah to be able to both accept either the Roimai and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. His opinion by the figs will allow him to take both sides over there, which is why he needed to argue by the figs. And the same thing is with Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yoisa, that he had a different understanding of this topic over here on Taros, and he can go with either the Roimoi and or with Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish.
Rabbi, if someone is walking through a cemetery, we never discussed the fact that what the piece of bone or whatever it was used to be. We just always said, this is what you stepped on, therefore you're tameh.
Okay, you look at the present. Exactly. Very good. You look at the present. Shkoyach. Now, Tamon Taninon. So let me, now again, we have to go by heart at who says what over here. So let me say what Rabbi Meir says, and then we will see the challenge that Rabbi Yehuda has on Rav Meir and two different ways of understanding the challenge. Rav Meir holds that Rav Meir holds that they would fill up the measurement of an asaran with flour, and listen to this, Aviv. They would take a little piece off. They would take a little bit of flour off, and they would mix that flour into water. Even though that in the Beis Hamikdash things went through quick. So that little flour and water that first sat on its own, became not gewaldige chametz, but it began to become chametz. And then they took that piece of dough and they buried it back in the flour in the isarin. So that's the way Rav Meir resolves the issue of the shear, because they only had an isarin. You want to make it chametzik, so that's the best way. That's the quickest way of doing it without having to add sourdough. You made a new sourdough from the flour. It just takes a long time. So when you have a little bit, somehow it works better. They took a little bit of flour off. They mixed it with water. They waited, let's say, we say 18 minutes, whatever the time is. It began to become chametzik. They took that and they put that back. So they only used the isarin that they started out with for those few loaves of bread that had to be chametzik.
Are they allowed to use like is it sourdough starter and allowed to use instead of like the flour?
That's what we're speaking about. Rav Meir holds, listen. So Rav Meir holds that since you have to have the share of an isarin, making sourdough really takes a long time. But I don't want to introduce new sourdough, according to Rav Meir, because then I'm going to have the isarin plus.
No, but then what if you like take out the amount of flour they're going to put in?
Wait. You're going to Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Meir says, you fill it up. Listen, you fill it up. Take out a little bit of flour, mix it with water, wait the minimum time for it to begin to become chametzik. It's not great chametzik. It's not very contagious. You're not going to have a real zaftika piece of sourdough at the end, but it's chametz. Put it back in the flour, and that's the way you make the shtei halechem, and that's the way you're going to make those 10 loaves of bread. The Rabbi Yehuda doesn't like it, probably because it's not proper chametz, and also because it takes too much time. We don't want to make a system where you have to wait to begin making chametzik. So what Rabbi Yehuda says, that you are allowed to bring sourdough from elsewhere. You bring listen, you already have sourdough, the sourdough that people grow here like a pet for a month. Now you take a piece of that sourdough, you have the keli of an isarin, you take a piece of sourdough, Aviv, I think you were saying that you put it in the keli, and then fill it up with flour. So what do you have? So you have one isarin that already has in it proper sourdough. There's a problem with that. What's the problem with that? Now, why wouldn't Rav Meir said it? So that's the Amruloi. By the way, because the Chachamim sided with Rav Meir, that you can't bring outside sourdough. You're magdish the isarin, and you deal with that. You make the chametz from the original flour. You, Rabbi Yehuda, you think you have a better solution because you're having a much better piece of chametz. Tamon Taninon, Amruloi. All of them, with Rav Meir, they challenged Rabbi Yehuda, af he hoisa chasera or yisera, that you will have a problem no matter what will happen. Either it's going to be less, you really will have less than a isarin of flour, or you're gonna have more than an isarin of flour. There's no way you're gonna have the right shear. Now, the way we will learn the Gemara, this is very important. The either or is mamish of whether you look at the present or whether you look at the past and the present. Listen to me. If not, you're going to get stuck here. The either or is one or the other. In other words, the Chachamim themselves over here were acknowledging that there are two ways of looking at the present, but whichever way you look at the present, you're going to have a problem. So first of all, before we explain the words that they told Rabbi Yehuda, that adding sourdough is going to be chaseda or yeseda, first of all, mani omri loy, who were the ones that challenged Rabbi Yehuda, says our Gemara, it's Rav Meir. Because he is quoted over there. He is the one that says that you got to make new sourdough. And he gives that, the quickest way is just beginning with a little bit of flour, like we mentioned. Now, Gemara explains. First of all, when you make sourdough, sometimes the sourdough is called yafa. It's a superior type of sourdough. A superior type of sourdough, Aviv, means that right now it's really big. It's big. Don't forget, isarin is a measure. If you have a proper piece of sourdough and you put it in the measure of an isarin, how much space is it taking? It's taking up more space than its original flour. This sourdough, prior to it becoming inflated with chametz dika gaiva dika ear, it was small. It was humble. And when the sa'or, that you are introducing is a good, superior type of sourdough, which would mean that vuhu tafuach, it's really expanded. Which means ha'ilu soilis haisa, prior to it expanding, when this sourdough that was made of other flour, when that was still in a flour state, prior to its expansion, it was semeka, it was shriveled, it was more compact. And you're filling up this external sourdough in the cup of an isadoin, you must view the expanded to really be its original size. Now, let me tell you the way I'm going to learn these words over here, even though it's a little bit difficult. We're not talking about looking at the past, my friends. We're looking at the present. Look at the present. Listen to what, if not, it's not going to work later. But when you look at the present sourdough, you have to discount the air. The tafuach of chametz is nothing, it's luft. Right now, if you were to look at the flour of the present, it's less than the expanded size of the sourdough through which it's manifesting. And in other words, what will be the bottom line? Think about it, David. If the sourdough is taking up too much space, and I'm filling up the cup until the top, do I have the right amount of an isarin? No, I don't. Why not? Do I have extra or less? No, I have less. I have less. Why do I have less? Because what filled it up until the top is not flour. The sourdough piece in it that's inflated with air, don't look at the air, look at it as it is. Right now, there's flour. The flour in it would have taken up less space. If you would discount the air, then you would need more flour to fill up the cup. If you would take away the inflation of the air, you would need more flour to hit the isarin. You don't have an isarin of flour. You have almost an isarin of flour and the rest of air. That's v'niras chaseda. Another problem. The other problem is that sometime, I don't know, I'm not a maven in making bread. If the sourdough did not come out well, it becomes very hard. Actually, we're going to say that it's possible that the compactness of the flour that's in a very bad, inferior type of sourdough product is so compacted together that had this been just flour, it would have taken up more space. And now, because of the sourdough being of very bad quality, the sourdough is compacted. And if you wouldn't have made it into this horrible sourdough, the flour in its natural state, it would have been more expanded. Now, listen to these words. You're saying you filled up the cup is full until the top. But he's saying that you have to view the compacted flour as if it's expanded. You have to view it that way. You are viewing it as if it's expanded. It's taking up that amount of space. But really, it would have taken up less space. And therefore, so again, if it would have taken up more space, and you're filling it up until the top with flour, so do you have extra flour or do you have less flour? You have extra flour. If you wouldn't have compacted this flour in the bat sourdough, then the cup would have gotten filled with less.
Rabbi.
Yes.
This question is only on a situation where you use external starter as opposed to using your own
because
flour from the
Meir says, take the flour. Let's say this is an isadim. I'm holding a cup for people who are not watching. If you fill up this cup with an isadim, I have the right shear. You're good. I have an isadim, and I'm magdish it l'shem that carbon. It makes a lot of sense. Now make it into chametz. So they're going to take a piece of flour out and they're going to make it into chametz, which you have to wait time, and you don't have enough time. It's not going to become gavaldik or chametz. I don't care if it's going to be good sourdough or bad sourdough. I already have the right amount. Rabbi Yehuda is the one that says, no, you don't have to begin. Get external sourdough, put the sourdough in the isarin measure, and fill it up with flour. Says Rav Meir and everyone else to Rabbi Yehuda, if sourdough is either bigger or smaller. It's either bigger or smaller, which means that really you're going to have the wrong shiur. Either you're going to have too little isarin, less than an isarin, or more than an isarin. So that's why they argued with him. Now, how does it relate to our topic? So now, says the Gemara, we have to work out the way Rabbi Yirmiyah will understand Pshat and the way Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yosef will learn Pshat. Al date de Rabbi Yirmiyah, what did we say in Rabbi Yirmiyah, Aviv? That we see in the present the original state. That's the way he understands. The Reimoi v'Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish shloshten amru davar echad b'Yisera. They will all focus on the problem of an oversized mincha. In other words, what we are saying is that we look not at the present, but we look at how this used to be. So we're speaking about the case where the sourdough is contracted. It's a bad sourdough. And we're saying that before it was contracted together in this bad, hard rock sourdough, the flour actually took up more space. So Adarabba, that will be the source from where you will see, according to everyone, because this is a Tana, this is a Mishnah. No one is arguing with the Mishnah. That in the present you look at the past. So when you have a poorly leavened sourdough, you look at it as it is in its original expanded flour state. So that's Gavaldik. Now, based on that, Rabbi Yirmiyah Taka says, in the case of the figs, that when you look at a shriveled up fig, you don't look at it in its current state, you look at it as it was in its original state. So the question now will be, why do they argue over there in Masechtas Tares? And the answer is because, first of all, that explains the Reisha. Why does it explain the Reisha? We look at the original state. So if it didn't begin with a Kazayas, talk about the Reisha, you have to have the size of a Kazayas. When it doesn't have a size of a Kazayas, we have to say that when it comes to the dinam of Tum and Tara, we look at the present, we look at the past. But Rabbi Yirmiyah said, no. It's going to work like the Reimoi say, if it never had the original state, if it never had the size of the original state, that would make sense to the Reimoi that hold that it won't be matame. When will it be matame? If it got swelled up with water, only if swollen with water, only if it already had a kazayis. We always have to look at the past. And Rabbi Yochanan and Ish Lakish will hold I'm going to speak this out in 1 second. Shloshim will be Yisera. Here, I'm missing one part over here. The difference is, Gemara doesn't speak it out. The difference between the figs and the case of a mincha is that you look at the present. When you look at the present, you see the past, you have to see its natural state. You only get to see the past and the present if the past is the item in its natural state. That's the word. So when it comes to flour, the reason why they challenged Rabbi Yehuda by saying that if the sourdough is very compacted, you don't look at it as compacted. You have to look at it as more expanded. So it already took up more space. So if you're going to fill up the Yisara, you're going to have too much flour. Why do we look at the past? Because the past is that item in its natural state. That's Gavaldik. Same thing with the fig. The fig used to be big, so even though now it's shriveled up, you look at it as it used to be in its natural state. And in its natural state. And that's where the Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish and the Rimari have room to argue. Which everyone agrees that if in the original it was a kazayis in Taras, if the natural state was a kazayis, now it's shriveled up, now it's expanded. For sure, you see it the way it used to be and the way it is right now. But what happens if it was never in the size of a kazayis or a kabetza? Here, there's a room for argument. Here, you can say that when do we look at the past? Only if the past was in its natural state. The Roimoy says that if this was never a kazayis, then it cannot be matame. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish hold that I don't care that it wasn't in the past in its natural state. I don't care about that. It's like a new thing. Now that it's expanded with water, say that now it has that size. That's very good. That fits. And all of that, in other words, the source of Rabbi Yirmiyah that argues that when you look at something now, you have to see how it used to be. Actually, the source will be from that side of the argument against Rabbi Yehuda that says that if the sourdough is bad and therefore it's contracted, you don't look at it as it is contracted. You have to make believe that it's expanded. It's really more. It's more. And therefore, the mincha will be oversized. That's the source for Rabbi Yirmiyah. And everyone agrees to that, that if something in the past had a natural state, you see that natural state in the present. The question will be is if something in the past did not have that natural state. That's a new machloikas. That's the machloikas of the Rimai, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Turning to the Daf Chavdal Adam Beis, it's Gavaldik. Al data the Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yossi that they hold that you don't look at the things the way they used to be. You dafka look at things the way they are. They are using, they will lean on the side of the argument that they made against Rabbi Yehuda in the case of when you had good sourdough, and what are we saying? That good sourdough is very much expanded. And therefore you don't even have enough. So what do they learn from over there? That we don't judge an item based on its expanded state, which is the case where the sourdough is very big. That's the way they're going to learn pshat over there. You don't look at something in its expanded state. You look at something as it is in its contracted state. And if you look at something the way it is in its contracted state, therefore, they say that if the Tana Rabbi Yossi would have held that you have to give the percentage of volume, you look at it in its contracted state, the pressed figs have less volume than the full figs. Gavaldik. And therefore, it must be that the Tana Rabbi Yossi holds that we don't care about volume, we only care about number. Now, when it comes to the case of Taras, that over there in Taras we're saying that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish say that if it's expanded with water, we view it in its current state. And over there in Menachos, we say that even though it's sourdough, we don't view it in its current state. There's a big nafkamina. The nafkamina is that in Menachos, sourdough is expanded with air. The air doesn't count. So it's taking up too much room in the Isarim. It turns out that it's going to be chasera. Masha'enken Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish will hold that if something is expanded with water, water is more substantial than air. That must be the nafkamina that they make. So they hold with the Mishnah Menachos that if it's expanded with air, we discount the air. We only look at things in its current state, but you have to discount the air. In the case of kazayis, in the case of a kibetza, water is not air. Water is more substantial. Even if something was not a kazayis, you look at the present. Right now, it's expanded with water. This is more substantial, according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and therefore it could be metame. Now, Says the Gemara that Elon the Barpate, there were people in the household of Barpati that when they would cook rice, there was a time that prior to them separating Trumas from Mises, which is what they should have done, they didn't do it yet, and they cooked the rice. What happens when you put rice in water and you cook it? It expands. It's a lot more than that. Anshun misakno yase, since in the case where they forgot to be misakin it beforehand, is chavra yesovra neimar. So what did the Chachamim advise them to do? That yisav chaye lu lekavel mevashel, that you are allowed to take raw rice in the percentage of the cooked rice. So let's say if we're speaking about Trumas Meiser, so let's say they had, I don't know, they had a liter, they had 10 liters of cooked rice, from which you have to give how much? 1 liter. And they allowed for 1 liter of raw rice to be given for the 10 liters of cooked rice. Why would they say that? Why would they say that? Because they were allowing for the water, like Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish, to be now part of the rice. So I have the total amount of the present with the water, and the raw rice doesn't have that much, doesn't have any water in it. It doesn't matter. The measurement of the exactly 10% is based on 1/10 of what you have cooked. So Amar Loin, Uf Ana Amar Kain, that Amar Rabbi Yosi, that Moira Rabbi Yosi says, Uf Ana Amar Kain, Lama Shedarkei Litfayach. In other words, something that naturally would have expanded, then I would have agreed with you. But when it comes to rice, rice only expands with water. He doesn't accept for water to be considered part of the rice. So for you to get the right measurement of Trumas HaMaasros, you have to look at the cooked rice as it was in its original size. As it was in its original size. And therefore, you're going to end up giving, my friends, a lot less Trumas HaMaasros, just for the record. You're going to benefit because the 10 liters of right now cooked rice started out much less. Rice expands when you cook it. So you end up giving less.
Once again, if you're giving from the dried rice for the volume of the cooked rice, you would be giving more, no? Not
That's
less.
right. That's what we're saying over here. You don't have
So
to do
it's the
that.
benefit
In
of
other
the
words, we
lady
see that this question of whether water going into something, this is already correlated to the Mishnah that we have in Taros, whether that item now is viewed with the water, or we say no. That was the Reimoi. The Reimoi said that no, I don't care that right now it's a kazayas. If it was never a kazayas, it's only kazayas with water. The water is not part of it. Water is like air. In this case, it would have to be a leniency. At Kan Chavra, I know it's late, but we'll start tomorrow. We'll start maybe a few minutes early, and we'll begin tomorrow, Mishnah Gimel.